Imagine setting off on a drive you've made 100 times before, arriving at your destination feeling like yourself, and only afterward discovering that 9 extra days have quietly vanished from your life. No crash to explain it. No blackout you can feel. No sense that anything at all happened in between. Just a calendar on the wall that refuses to agree with your own memory, and the people who love you looking at you like you've come back from the dead. That is exactly what a New Zealand businessman says happened to him on an otherwise unremarkable Monday morning, and what he claims followed would go on to divide believers and skeptics for more than 30 years. His name is Alec Newald, and everything you're about to hear is drawn directly from the account he himself has given, in interviews, in radio appearances, and in the book he eventually wrote about it. In the middle of February 1989, Newald left his home in Rotorua, a city built on the geothermal heart of New Zealand's North Island, a place known for its steaming vents, mineral pools, and the faint sulfur smell that visitors either love or can't stand. He was heading north to Auckland for a routine piece of business, a drive he had made so many times he barely had to think about the route. On a good day, with clear roads and calm weather, it took about 3 hours. There was nothing about that particular morning that felt different. The sky was clear, the traffic was light, and Newald was, by every account, including his own, a practical and grounded man. He ran his own business. He lived by schedules and figures and deadlines. He was not a man given to flights of imagination, and he had no reason to expect that day would be anything other than routine. He remembers the early part of the drive with total clarity, the green hills sliding past, the ordinary hum of the engine, the easy rhythm of a road he knew by heart. And then, by his own account, there is simply nothing. No memory of the rest of the journey. No sense of arriving. No gap he could feel opening up around him. The next thing he recalls is stepping out of the car in Auckland, feeling strangely tired and foggy, the way you feel after a night with almost no sleep. He assumed, reasonably enough, that it was simple exhaustion from the drive. What he did not yet know was that it was not the Monday he believed it to be. It was Thursday, more than a week later. 10 days had disappeared from his life, and as far as his own memory was concerned, only a single ordinary afternoon had gone by. What followed was immediate and deeply disorienting. Newald has described trying, in those first confused hours, to reconcile what his own mind was telling him with what everyone around him already knew. Friends and family who saw him were shaken, some visibly stunned, because in the time he had been gone, the people who cared about him had spent days growing worried, then frightened, wondering whether he was even still alive. And here he was, acting as though nothing unusual had happened at all, talking about a routine drive that, as far as everyone else was concerned, had swallowed more than a week of his life without a trace. There was no dramatic explanation waiting to tidy up the mystery. No record of an accident, no hospital admission, nothing that could account for where he had physically been. What there was, in the days and weeks that followed his return, was a growing list of strange physical symptoms that Newald says would not leave him alone. Headaches that no ordinary remedy could touch, sitting behind his eyes like a weight that refused to shift. A fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed able to repair, so that he would wake feeling as tired as when he'd lain down. Moments where his concentration would simply scatter mid-thought, leaving him standing in a room unsure of what he'd come in for. And beneath all of it, he says, a growing and unshakable feeling that something significant had happened to him during those missing days. Something his conscious mind had not yet been allowed to see clearly. According to Newald, that door didn't open all at once. It began, he says, with dreams vivid and recurring and strangely consistent from one night to the next, which unsettled him because ordinary dreams don't usually behave that way. At first there were only fragments, an impression of soft light with no visible source, glowing rather than shining, a feeling of weightlessness, a sense of being watched by presences he couldn't quite bring into focus, no matter how hard he tried. Night after night, he says, the same fragments returned, growing sharper each time instead of fading the way dreams normally do, until he began to suspect he wasn't imagining anything at all. He came to believe he was recovering something real, piece by piece, the way an old photograph slowly reveals itself in developing. Around this same period, Newald's account takes an even stranger turn. He has said that not long after his return, he was visited by two men who identified themselves as scientists connected to a government research body. Their questions, he says, focused with unusual intensity on the car he had been driving that day, a vehicle that had developed persistent, unexplained mechanical problems, and which he eventually sold. Unsettled by the visit, he relocated without telling anyone his new address, only, he claims, to be tracked down again by the same men weeks later. It was shortly after that second encounter, he says, that the fragmented dream images he'd been having began to surface with real force, no longer something he could easily wave away as ordinary sleep. What Newald eventually pieced together, and later wrote about in detail, is an account of being taken from that highway by beings he describes as neither human nor part of any world he recognized, and carried aboard something that felt to him more grown than built. He is careful every time he tells it to acknowledge how difficult these memories are to translate into ordinary language. He describes the sensation of floating free of his own body, aware and thinking, but without the familiar weight of arms to lift or a heartbeat to mark the passing seconds, a point of consciousness drifting somewhere with no up, no down, and no visible edges. He says that in the instant before real fear could take hold, something communicated with him directly, not as a voice carried on sound, but as meaning placed whole and complete into his mind, telling him he was safe, and that he had been brought there for a reason. The beings themselves, in Newald's telling, were unsettling precisely because they were so human-like, rather than matching the imagery familiar from popular science fiction. He described slender figures roughly his own height, with limbs that seemed a little too long for their frames, smooth hairless heads larger in proportion than a human skull, and eyes set narrow and deep. He says they communicated entirely through a kind of direct, wordless transfer of thought and emotion together, meaning and feeling arriving as a single package. One among them, he says, took on the role of guide, someone he came to describe with real warmth, almost as a mentor figure who watched over him during his stay. He also describes being given a kind of garment unlike anything from our world, something that felt alive rather than woven from cloth, which he says sharpened the communication between them and widened his awareness the moment it settled onto him. From there, Newald's account moves to what he came to call their homeworld, a place he later named Haven in his writing. He describes vast, quiet cities built along a coastline, architecture that curved and spiraled rather than standing in hard right angles, towers that seemed to have grown upward rather than been constructed by hand, gardens threaded between structures that glowed faintly from within, and an overall stillness he found remarkable, a place, in his words, that wasted nothing and produced no smoke and no noise. It was here, he says, that he was taught, over what felt to him like an extended stay lasting well beyond a few hours, about the origins of humanity, teachings that would eventually form the philosophical core of the book he published. According to Newald, he was told that humanity did not arise purely by chance, that our species had been deliberately guided and refined over a long stretch of time toward greater intelligence, creativity, and a spiritual sensitivity meant to be a natural part of who we are. He says he was also told that something interfered with that design relatively recently in our history, cutting humanity off from abilities and awareness it once had, shortening lifespans, and leaving behind only a faint, culturally inherited memory of that loss, a memory he believes shows up in the myths nearly every culture tells about a paradise once lost or a golden age left behind. He describes being told, further, that many of humanity's great ancient monuments were never simple tombs or temples at all, but structures built with deliberate geometry meant to preserve knowledge, left waiting for humanity to grow capable of understanding them again. He is upfront every time he tells this part that none of it can be independently verified. It is, in his own words, information he was given, not something he can prove to anyone else. When he finally returned home, still believing, he says, that only a few hours had passed rather than 10 days, the strangeness did not end there. Newald has spoken for decades about a long period of alleged harassment that followed his decision to go public with his story. Surveillance he believed he was under, a break-in at his home in which personal items went missing, and repeated contact from men he associated with intelligence or government interests who, he claims, pressured him more than once to stay quiet about what he remembered. He has always maintained that he refused, insisting that telling the story, whatever it cost him personally, mattered more than staying silent about it. Newald eventually put the entire account into writing in a book titled Coevolution, first published in 1989, complete with detailed illustrations he commissioned of the beings and places he says he encountered during those missing days. The book found a dedicated audience among people fascinated by accounts of contact with non-human intelligence, and it remains one of the more detailed and internally consistent abduction narratives to emerge from that era, largely because Newald has told the story the same way, in the same order, across more than 3 decades of retellings. Whether that consistency reflects a genuinely preserved memory or simply a well-practiced narrative honed over the years is something researchers, skeptics, and enthusiasts continue to argue about, and there remains no independent physical evidence, no verified medical record of the symptoms he describes, no corroborating documentation beyond his own testimony that settles the question either way. What can be said with real confidence is this: Alec Newald is a real person who has told a version of this same extraordinary story consistently since 1989. The unexplained gap in his memory, the physical symptoms that followed his return, and his firm insistence that something happened to him on that highway have never wavered across decades of interviews and public appearances. Everything beyond that, the beings, the world he calls Haven, the teachings about humanity's lost design, remains entirely his personal testimony, offered without independent proof, and presented to you here exactly as such, as his account and his alone. So here is the question worth sitting with as you go about your own day. Is Alec Newald describing something real that his mind has struggled for decades to translate into ordinary language, the lingering trace of an undiagnosed medical or psychological event, or a story shaped and reshaped over years of retelling until it hardened into something that feels, even to him, indistinguishable from memory? There is no verified answer, and maybe that uncertainty is the most honest place to leave it. What do you think really happened somewhere on that quiet stretch of highway between Rotorua and Auckland? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And if stories like this pull at your curiosity the way they pull at mine, subscribe, because there's another one just as strange waiting for you next time.